You are in, and we are live on YouTube.
I'm in by my phone. I can't get in with the computer. I'll have to kick that later.
It still sounds good.
gonna hire a staff person to kind of do what Dunn did.
You hear me, Zeb?
I got you.
I wonder if we should stay on mute.
Hey, Bonnie. You're muted. Did we have any communications? I didn't get an email from
I'm
you.
sorry, no, other than the one that I sent you from for the hearing or
For the commissioners?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
the annexation I meant, yeah,
Yeah, I got that.
okay.
Yeah.
Do we have Kyle?
I'm here. Hold on a second.
All right.
There we
Just want to make sure we have your bright, sunshiny face on the Zoom call for the world to see.
go. Sorry, I got sidetracked.
It's now 7:31. I'll call this meeting of the Bellefontaine City Council to order. Please rise for the invocation, followed by the pledge, led by Councilman Springs.
Lord, we are meeting today to conduct matters of business. Guide our hearts and our minds in the spirit of fairness, right thought, and speech. Impart your supreme wisdom upon our activities so that our affairs may reach a successful conclusion. Thank you for being our source of guidance today. Amen. Of the United States of America. And now I was one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Councilman Springs. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mrs. Baker? Here. Mr. DeSoma?
Here.
Mrs. James?
Here.
Mr. Kurtz?
Here.
Mr. Lyle? Mr. Reeser?
Here.
Mr. Springs?
Here.
Mick is here. He was muted, and so was I. I guess we're all a little
Yep.
not
Not now.
in order today. Yeah. So
Okay.
may I have a motion to suspend the reading of the minutes?
I'll make a motion.
Mr. Springs, seconded by Mr. Reeser.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma?
Yes.
Mrs. James?
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz?
Yes.
Mr. Lyle?
Yes.
Mr. Reeser?
Yes.
Mr. Springs?
Yes.
Are there any additions or corrections to the reading of the minutes? Seeing none, we'll move to administrative reports. Mayor's office, Mayor Stoller.
Good evening, members of council. I'll make it short and sweet. I don't have a report, but I do want to share something with you. You're never too late to learn. Last week, I was on a Zoom meeting, and the person who was administrator over the meeting said, if you want to speak, you don't have to find that mute and unmute. Try this, if you will. You just touch down your space bar if you're on a computer, and as soon as you let go, you go back to mute. Now it was pretty slick. And so I've used that now in a couple meetings, even though my computer's failing me in the office, so I'm using my phone. But you can try that because I know we still struggle with mute, unmute. It's difficult. Anyhow, bless you all, but no particular report from me tonight. I am working on a more of a comprehensive report that I'll give to you in 2 weeks on not only where we're at on various housing projects. I know that's exciting to share with you, but we have a few irons in the fire for coming events. So stay tuned. Thanks all.
Pressing my space bar, it is totally working. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Are there any questions for the mayor? Seeing none, we'll move to Service Safety Director, Mr. Henry.
Using my space bar, it's hard to believe it's taken us 9 months or something to figure out that pressing the space bar unmutes us. But what a cool trick, and I'm using it right now, of course. I don't have much of a report, but I would just like to say our police department posted on Facebook today a good reminder for all of us as we move into the warmer weather here and more people are out and about. And we come up on the end of the school year. They asked people to watch their speed in the community and be aware that more children are going to be around on foot and on their bicycles, as well as adults. People are just out and about more. Motorcycles are on the roads. I would just throw it out there that, as a community, we should watch our speed and try to be as safe as we can as motorists in our town, especially in our downtown area where we all know that we're experiencing a great amount of business at our local businesses. And that includes a lot of traffic downtown and parking downtown. And we all need to be courteous and safe through that area so that that we can continue to have a good time in our downtown and not worry about safety for our pedestrians and motorists. So just throwing that out there. Thank you, Mr. President, and good evening, council.
Thank you, Mr. Henry. Are there any questions for Mr. Henry? Mr. Lau?
Yeah, Mr. Henry, do you know what the status is on the sign for the service signs up on North Main that fell down? You know anything about it?
Signs for the service signs on North
About
Main.
Burger King. All the,
Are you talking about like clubs and that kind of
yeah,
thing?
the service
Oh,
clubs.
It had fallen down?
It's gone.
It's gone.
It
Okay.
fell down and then I assume the city took it.
Okay, I'm sure Jason Harmon has taken that down and he is probably making repairs in our
Okay.
street department and will hang it back up when it's fully repaired.
Okay, just had somebody
Yep.
comment, I went and looked and it was leaning sideways and busted, the pole busted. And then next day it was gone. So I'll go down and check with him so I can report
Okay.
back.
I'll check on it, Mr. Lyle, and
Okay.
make sure that it gets up as soon as we can, okay?
Thank you very much.
All right, you're welcome.
Anything else for Mr. Henry? Seeing none, we'll move to Law Director, Mr. Stolley.
Good evening, council. I'm reporting live from Southview Park here this evening. It's good to see the community out and about and baseball being played. I have no legal report, but I'd be glad to answer any questions if there are any regarding the legislation this evening.
Any questions for Mr. Stolley? Seeing none, we'll move to Auditor's Report, Mr. Brentlinger.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have no report this evening, but will answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. Brentlinger. Any questions for Mr. Brentlinger? Seeing none, we'll move to Parks Department, Mr. Myers.
All right, when I hit spacebar, I turned off my video, so I don't know what I did wrong. No real report other than talk about our community service day out at Myra that's going to be taking place on Saturday, May 8th. I believe we're going 9 to 1. So anybody who would like to participate in that, please give our office a call, and we'd be happy to get you set up with that. So looking forward to a great day of service out there. And just really excited for all the great, like Josh said, it's awesome to go through the park and just see all the activity up and raring. And so it's been a lot of fun. Excited getting some pool stuff done. Really excited to get it opened up again this year. So just a lot of great projects in the works to make sure we're have a great summer.
Thank you, Mr. Myers. Mrs. Baker, you got a question?
Yeah, Mr. Myers, has there been a good response for the May 8th?
Yes, we have had a really nice response. We even have a school group from Riverside has shown an interest, and we've got many families with bringing their teenagers out to be a part of it, and so we're really excited with the response we received so far.
Good.
Any other questions for Mr. Myers? Seeing none, that will conclude our reports from administration. We'll now move to reports from standing committees. Finance Committee, Mrs. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have several ordinances for, we have a resolution this evening, and this is for a new municipal court fund to handle the PERS pension. Since we've had some police officers that have been working, covering the bailiff or the security at the court, they needed to have a separate line in a separate fund for those pension payments, since that's a different system. And so that needs to be adopted this evening. And then we have ordinance B is for first reading only. This is for the fire department for equipment. This is the Marks grant that actually I think was came about at the end of the year, but they got the Marks grant for $20,200. But then that can go back now into once the grant has been awarded, it'll go back into the equipment line. So we're asking for first reading for only for that tonight. And then ordinance 2024 is for also for the fire department. This is for, there's two different items here. One is for repair and maintenance for the aerial ladder truck that had just several small things, but came up to $12,200 for repairs for that. And then we also need an additional $13,000 in order to fix the swivel for the aerial truck. So we are hoping to be able to get the grant for a new truck, aerial truck, but right now we need to keep this one running so that we have something to be able to use. So we're asking for first reading only on that one as well. Ordinance 2125 is capital equipment purchase for the surveying equipment and software for the engineering department. The software will not be supported anymore when we get to the end of the year. So the cost is $20,100. This will give us a chance to be able to get the new and make sure that it's working, everything's working correctly before it's not supported anymore. We're asking for first reading only on that one as well. Then the ordinances for second reading. The first four are all have to do with the compensation packages that would cover everybody else in the city besides fire and police. Those are separate contracts. But what we have traditionally done is whatever raise the police and fire get, the rest of the city does as well. So on each one of these, the A is for covers the wages, pension, Medicare, and the pension reserve funds are also affected by those wages. So we're asking for second and final on that one. Then the next one is the compensation package for the clerical workers. That's a 2% raise as well. Second and final on that one. The next one is compensation package for the service workers. That's a 2% raise as well. All of these are just, just for the, I don't know what I was going to say there. And then the third one or the fourth one is the supervisory pay ordinance, and that is also a 2%. So we're asking for second and final for all of those because for adoption this evening are the two contracts for the fire and police, and we would like to be able to make all the wage increases at the same time. So that's why we're asking for second and final on all of those. And then ordinance 2119 is the construction project for the Blue Jacket Creek enclosure. And because this would, I don't know if you remember, but when we originally went out to bid for this, it came back in, the bid was much higher than what our estimate was. And when it's 10% over, we have to bring it back to the floor. But we only have 60 days after the opening of the bids to either accept or award the bid or to reject it. So if we wait till the next meeting, it'll be too late. So we need to move ahead and pass this on second and final as well. So we'll be asking to waive the 3 reading rule on each one of those. And then up for adoption this evening are the 2 contracts for firefighters and Bellefontaine Police Department. And we'll be asking for adoption on both of those. And that ends my report, Mr. President. Thank you.
Mr. Lyle, Safety Committee?
Oh, I'm sorry, no report.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Lyle. Utilities Committee, Mr. Springs.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Utilities Committee met 4/22 from about 4:10 until 5:13. We discussed the water and sewer rates, the City of Oakwood survey. At the next meeting, there's going to be some legislature cleaning up the wording in one of the refuge ordinances. And then we did also talk about peak fiber. And at this time, we have decided to pass on a resolution for it. And that concludes my report.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Springs. Sidewalks, Curbs, and Parks Committee, Mrs. James.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have no report tonight.
Thank you, Mrs. James. Audit Committee, Mr. DeSoma.
Thank you, Mr. President. No report.
Thank you, Mr. DeSoma. And I skip Rules Committee. Rules Committee, Mr. Kurt. Sorry, I skipped Rules Committee. Rules Committee, Mr. Kurtz.
Thank you, Mr. President. Rules Committee has one ordinance on the agenda this evening, 2113C. It's up for third reading. It's to amend the codified ordinances establishing residency requirements of certain employees. And we'll be asking for adoption for that this evening. And I also received a copy of a notice to legislative authority for an applied for liquor permit. It was dropped in my mailbox and marked copy Rules Committee. That's the extent of my knowledge on that, but I wanted to let you know I received it. And that.
Bonnie. Thank you, Mr. Kurtz. Bonnie.
I dropped that off. I always hand those off to just a copy to the Rules Committee. I'll bring that up in my report in case anybody has any questions about that, but that was me.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
That concludes our reports from standing committees. We'll now move to communications from citizens. As per our standing rule, we ask that any citizens that wish to communicate with council do so by submitting their comments in writing by 6:00 p.m. the Sunday immediately preceding City Council. The clerk informed me prior to our meeting today that there were no communications from citizens other than a communication that we received from the Logan County Commissioners that I'll discuss later in the comments from council section. I did receive a letter from the Planning Commission dated April 15th. Bonnie, did you receive that as well? Did you receive the Planning Commission letter from April 15th?
What was the subject of that?
It was based upon the meeting on Tuesday, April 13th, to consider a request to Jerry Robinson to rezone the current R3 multifamily residential district to B3 general business district for 1001 North Main Street and 1005 North Main Street, containing 1.542 acres in total to allow for future development. The Planning Commission heard the Planning Commission hearing. The commission voted in favor to approve the rezoning as presented. I received that from Mr. Notestein.
I did not.
Okay. I will provide that to you for the record.
Okay.
Mr. President, if I may.
Yes, Mr. Sally.
The next step on that matter would be I will be presenting legislation to change that zoning as recommended. So council will see that at the next meeting.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying. That concludes our communications from citizens. We'll now move to our legislative agenda for this evening, ordinances and resolutions for first reading.
A resolution establishing a new expense account within the general fund municipal court fund.
Mrs. Baker.
Move to adopt.
Second.
Seconded by Mr.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
An ordinance making supplemental appropriations and amending the permanent appropriations ordinance for purposes of general fund fire and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Motion to pass on first reading only.
Seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
An ordinance making supplemental appropriations and amending the permanent appropriations ordinance for purposes of general fund fire and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker.
Motion to pass on first reading only.
Seconded by Mrs. James.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
An ordinance making supplemental appropriations and amending the permanent appropriations ordinance for purposes of general fund engineering and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker.
Motion to pass on first reading only.
Seconded by Mrs. James.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
That concludes our ordinances for first reading. We'll now move to ordinances and resolutions for second reading.
An ordinance making supplemental appropriations and amending the permanent appropriations ordinance for purposes of various funds, wages, pension, Medicare, and pension reserve, and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker.
Motion to waive the three reading rule.
Seconded by Mrs. James.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Motion to pass on second and final.
Seconded by Mrs. James.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Move to adopt.
Seconded by Mrs. James.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
An ordinance establishing and providing for compensation for certain hourly employees of the city of Bellefontaine and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine. 2021 clerical workers pay ordinance.
Mrs. Baker.
Motion to waive the three reading rule.
Seconded by Mrs. James.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Motion to pass on second and final.
Seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Move to adopt.
Seconded by Mrs. James.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
An ordinance establishing and providing for compensation for certain hourly employees of the city of Bellefontaine and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio, 2021 service workers pay ordinance.
Mrs. Baker.
Motion to waive the three reading rule.
Seconded by Mrs. James.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Motion to pass on second and final.
Seconded by Mrs. James.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Move to adopt.
Seconded by Mrs. James.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
An ordinance establishing and providing for compensation for certain hourly employees of the city of Bellefontaine and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine. 2021 supervisory pay ordinance.
Mrs. Baker.
Oh, motion to waive the 3 reading rule.
Seconded by Mrs. James.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Motion.
You're
sorry.
muted, but that's
Motion.
second and final. I can
Yeah.
read lips now.
I'm sorry.
Seconded by
I mo-
Mrs.
I moved
James.
my hand and that was my on and off. Right.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Move to adopt.
Seconded by Mrs. James.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
An ordinance authorizing the Service Safety Director to enter into contract for the construction of the City of Bellefontaine Blue Jacket Creek Enclosure Project number 2021-01 and declaring an emergency in the City of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker.
Motion to waive the 3 reading rule.
Seconded by Mrs. James.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Mr. Springs was a yes. Mrs. Baker.
Motion to pass on second and final.
Seconded by Mrs. James.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Move to adopt.
Seconded by Mrs. James.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
That concludes our ordinances for second reading. We'll now move to ordinances for third reading.
An ordinance authorizing the mayor and service safety director to enter into a labor contract with the International Association of Firefighters, Bellefontaine chapter number 351, for a period of time from January 1st, 2021 through December 31st, 2021, and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker.
Move to adopt.
Seconded by Mrs. James.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
An ordinance authorizing the mayor and service safety director to enter into a labor contract with the Bellefontaine chapter of the Ohio Patrolmen's Benevolent Association and its membership for a period of time from January 1st, 2021 through December 31st, 2021, and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker.
Move to adopt.
Seconded by Mrs. James.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
An ordinance amending section 155.09 of the codified ordinances of the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio, establishing residency requirements of certain employees and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Kurtz,
Move to adopt.
seconded by Mr. Reeser.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSelma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs.
Yes.
That concludes our legislative agenda for this evening. Are there any communications from the clerk?
Yes, I received a notice from the Ohio Division of Liquor Control for 2 Icolds funeral home from Escape Route in West Liberty, Escape Route 508 Porches and Pools in West Liberty. And I will send this in as long as no one has a problem with that. If you have any questions or a problem with it, let me know, and then I will mail it.
I just have a quick question.
Mr. Springs?
iColts is requesting a liquor license?
It's 2 Icolts funeral home from Escape Route 508. And I'm trying to see if I'm guessing it's just a transfer. Please find enclosed a legislative notice that is being sent to you regarding the applied for liquor permit as captioned on the notice. You must, within 30 days from the mailed date, list on the notice under the barcode. And you know, it's always the same. You can request a hearing or not. Usually we don't.
The chief of police also has those, and we've had an occasion, it's been quite a while, to where if there has been an objection for any reason, such as a known establishment that's had issues with police reporting, they may raise an objection. But otherwise, it's just a liberty notice to the municipality.
Right. So, yeah,
Anything else from anybody on that?
I'll mail
Okay.
that in.
All right. Anything else
That's it for me.
Okay, thank you, Bonnie. Any communications from council? I got a couple things here, but I'll let anybody else go first if they want. In all the excitement of our new spacebar tool and toy, I got all jammed up, and I was also trying to coordinate the pickup of my son from baseball. I screwed up all the committee reports, and I skipped Streets Committee. So, Mr. Reeser, is there any report from Streets Committee?
No report. Thank you.
Okay. All right. I'm sorry about that. I apologize. Second, we have received a copy of the record, which is a standard procedure when there's going to be or a proposed annexation of property into the city of Bellefontaine. We've received the request for the annexation of 2 parcels, approximately 36 acres, owned by Thomas and Marker, to the city of Bellefontaine off of State Route 47 West. That has been approved by the county commissioners. Now it comes to us. We need to have a special hearing regarding the annexation request. We need to set that. I think we have to give 30 days notice for that hearing. And because of that, I think the month of May is out. So we're looking at the first meeting in June. That would be June 8th. We'll set that for a hearing. That will be 7 p.m. is when we usually do those. And I want to say that we might have had one other special hearing in the past for our Zoom sessions, and just don't know how I feel about that with this request, and especially because it's in June, and I was hopeful that we would all be back in person by then. And I didn't know what anybody thought about that, Mayor, or do you have any thoughts about the city building opening, or if we have, come in and give it an experimental shot for an in-person meeting, the first meeting in June?
Well, I think it's healthy to set as a goal. I'm with you. I can't wait. And then I think, and you did a really nice job of this, leading the group to ask their opinion. So I really think it's about you, the president, the body of 7, as well as Bonnie. It's really your meeting. Of course, David and I, the auditor, law director, were guests. But I think it's important for all of you to agree that you are also ready. And that's why I leave that ball in your court. We will, of course, if things don't lift, we still do the mathematics of where everybody can sit. So it won't be in that traditional setting until, and we may cross that finish line by June. Just too soon to tell you that we would go back to the way we could close our eyes and remember gathering, and we're actually elbow to elbow. Don't know.
My only concern is that, you know, we publish this notice, we got to say how we're going to do this and when we're going to do it, you know, whether it's going to be via Zoom or whether we're going to be in person. And I don't know, I can't remember if we've had, Mrs. Baker?
Is there a limit to how many people could come on to the Zoom meeting if we would just have a separate Zoom for the hearing?
I think it's, Chris?
I'm sure we could make that work. The only caveat to that I would share is, as of right now, this is my last Zoom meeting until we get through Little League Baseball. Because Coach Myers is taking precedent, and I apologize for that fact. But I'm sure we can make it available. We could do a special link for that night, and we could put that out to the public. And then whether it's Dave or someone else running the meeting, we can coordinate making that work.
Yeah, you know, and I think that, you know, I run Zoom meetings for the Logan County Bar Association, and I think they have and I don't know if we have a professional membership or not, but it's capped at like 44 people. And
ours is higher than that. Ours must be, I want to say I can do 150, but don't hold me to that. I can do some checking, get you an answer on that.
Anybody, Mrs. Baker?
Well, I'm not opposed to meeting in person, but you know, we would never get 150 people in the room and have never had that many people want to be in there.
No.
So
unless we're talking about sidewalks or trees.
Right.
Cats.
Taking them down or adding them, right?
Right. Parking spots. So let's just do that. Let's see if we can't set up a separate Zoom link for that meeting. And we'll just, when we do that publication for the meeting, we'll provide the link information. And then we'll still maintain our separate finance committee and council link information. So we'll have 3 links for that particular meeting that you guys will have to click on. And I think maybe that we should just do that. And I wish that we knew a little bit more as to how things were going to go. It's trending in the right direction, you know. But I don't want to gamble on that and then push this out any further and hamper any kind of efforts, you know, to get this annexed so we can do whatever, or whoever needs to do whatever they need to do once that property is part of the city. So
one other alternative, I'm sorry, President, one other alternative is to ask the school who's offered before to meet in person at the Distance Learning Center. That would offer more space. But I think you're onto something with, go ahead, since you have to post it, probably post the links.
Let's do that. Josh?
Mr. President, yeah, I would suggest, because let's just, if something goes wrong with a link, we need a new link, that it'll be held via Zoom and that the link will be made available to those that request by contacting the clerk and then she can have a list and follow up with the final link once we've worked that out, because we'll be getting this publication, you know, up in the next few days. Just a suggestion.
Okay, I agree. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Bonnie, go ahead.
Well, should I put that in the newspaper with the publication for the hearing?
Why don't you provide me with the typical
language,
the publication that you use, and I'll come up with something.
Okay.
And yeah, you'll put that in the paper.
At that same time in that notice?
Well,
in that
not the actual link. What we'll do is you send me the publication information. I'll edit it to include, language that if people want to participate in that special session, that they're to contact you via your email address for the login information for the Zoom meeting. Yeah.
And just one time, right? Advertise, this only needs one time, right? Okay.
Josh is shaking his head, yes.
And we'll get you those details, Bonnie.
What's that?
We'll get you those details for publication.
Okay.
Okay. Anything else? Any other communications from members of council? Thank you all for your input there. Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion and a second to adjourn.